What's up everyone, Thralls here once again. I'm the Crockneck and I am back with some more underrated albums, and yeah, I'm gonna do part 2 of the nu metal one. I decided I still had enough stuff on that list to actually do another one, and since nu metal is resurfacing somewhat, why not talk about some more that was actually pretty good at one point. Again, this is sort of an interesting period in time because a lot of this stuff was on major labels, which is kind of an odd thing to see metal on major labels now. It's just not really a thing anymore. Mostly it's just underground labels out there, which is cool. I love that fact because they're not trying to push for the radio, but the radio back then was a bigger thing than it is now. I don't even know what the fuck goes on the radio anymore. I don't listen to that shit. Now, this one I think is a little bit different because only 2 of the releases I have on here came out in the 90s. Most of this actually came out around the early 2000s, and I think 2002 was kind of where the big cutoff for nu metal happened. A lot of the nu metal bands were getting kind of booted off of labels, and I think you can kind of see the big shift in terms of what the next popular metal trend would be after that, which would be the whole mid-2000s metalcore boom. There's also a couple in here that I wouldn't necessarily call nu metal flat out, but they kind of got lumped in the pack, so I included them. Yeah, this has been an interesting trip down memory lane. Lots of memories of Ozfest once again, because that's where nu metal thrived, especially in the early 2000s. And yeah, let's just get into this because this should be fun. Nothingface, an audio guide to everyday atrocity. So their second album came out in 1998. This was a DC-based, I guess it pains me to call them nu metal, but I guess they kind of are. They kind of got, you know, lumped in that. I always consider them more groove metal, maybe alternative metal, but those mingled together, it kind of sounds like nu metal. If this is in fact nu metal, this is one of my favorite nu metal releases. I absolutely love this album. It's heavy, it's dark. It doesn't kind of go by all the nu metal tropes. It wasn't trying to ape Korn or Deftones or anything like that. This was intended to be heavy, dark, and visceral, and you get that right away with the opening track, Goldtooth. Like, there's this cool groove to it. The guitars kind of have like a more thrashy tone, like there's a big metallic chunk to it. It doesn't sound like, you know, the big down-tuned, super muddy sound that, you know, like Korn was really known for. Now, while Matt Holt's singing voice was kind of prototypical for nu metal, it kind of had that weird flutter to it, his harsh vocals were exceptionally vicious sounding. You couple that with the dark subject matter that is all over this, and you get a very vicious release. One of my favorite songs in here is the last track, The Sick. The chorus is just absolutely nasty. Just repeating one line, "You told me not to lie," but growled viciously. This band unfortunately seemed to fly under the radar for a lot of people. I actually had the pleasure of seeing them twice before they broke up not too long after their last album, Skeletons. Now, they did reform and do some shows, but sadly, Matt Holt, their frontman, died, and this band is defunct, unfortunately, which sucks because this band had a huge impact on me, and it still kind of kept me tethered to, like, you know, still a little bit of like the death metal and the groove metal and thrash metal, because this kind of fit in there too because it was much heavier. It didn't feel like it was shooting for radio. Even their more radio-ish singles that came out later were still super heavy, and that was probably why they didn't take off on the radio. But this album was a step forward from their first album, Pacifier, which was way more chaotic and nuts. This actually showed some real songwriting skill, some real good uses of melody, but it kept it vicious, and this album is underrated as hell. And I would say the band in general is underrated as hell. If you've never jammed this, I strongly recommend this one. Call it groove metal, call it alternative metal, call it nu metal if you want, but this is just a flat out good album regardless of what you call it. So check it out. The Deadlights, self-titled. This is the lone studio album from this Long Beach band. Came out in 2000 on Elektra Records. And unfortunately, this band has a short and kind of tragic history as well. Unfortunately, going through a lot of these bands, there have been some tragedies along the way, and it's pretty unfortunate. But this band, I think, was really interesting in terms of all of the elements that they brought in. This band definitely was nu metal. It had all the nu metal tropes, the big down-tuned guitars, the kind of, you know, bouncy rhythms to it, the, you know, nu metal groove. But they also brought in alternative elements. The song Sweet Oblivion honestly sounds like a heavier version of Smashing Pumpkins. But if you listen to songs like Amplifier or Pox Eclipse, you get to hear them at some of their heaviest material. This band had a little bit of the old groove metal sound to it, you know, kind of like the mid-90s thing before nu metal really blew up. And I kind of dug that. The vocals on here are interesting when it comes down to the clean vocals. The dude that fronted this band does not look like he should have those vocals because they're very, I don't know, like nasally and kind of like an upper register. You know, definitely screamed more of like an alternative band from the 90s, like Blind Melon, except metal. I tried to figure that out. But when it came down to his harsh vocals, they were shrieked, distorted, and vicious as hell. I saw these guys open for Typo Negative and Cold Chamber, I think in 2001, and I also saw this band at Ozfest, I think 2003 or 2002? Maybe 2001? I don't know. I went to a lot of Ozfest, and some of the lineups kind of run together, but I definitely saw them there. I always felt that this album came out maybe too late. Like if this came out in the mid-90s, it might have blown up a little bit more just because it had a lot of sounds from that era. Honestly, I could see tracks from this showing up on the Crow soundtrack. It kind of would have fit that whole feel. But it came out when it did, and this band was very short-lived. In fact, they broke up not too long after this release. The frontman and the rest of the band had a not-so-amicable split, and they were defunct pretty quickly. Now, sadly, I did bring up tragedy. The frontman of this band ended up dying of a heroin overdose, I believe, which flat out sucks. He was very young. He ended up in a band called Droid, which was like a groove metal band. I believe one of the members of Korn was tied to that, at least in terms of like finding them or producing them. But it sucks that he died, and heroin's a real motherfucker, and just don't do it. But yeah, this is just kind of an interesting album. Don't know where it really fits in, but it kind of got lumped in the nu metal pack, and I figured why not bring it up, because this album has some really good songs on it and has kind of a unique sound for that era. So if you've never checked out this band, this is the only release by them, so definitely check it out. Cold, 13 Ways to Bleed on Stage. Definitely one of the more well-known ones, but I still think they're underrated. This was their second album, came out in 2000 on Flip Records, and if you know that label, that is tied to Fred Durst. This was one of the bands that he discovered that I think ended up being better than his band. Anyway, this band formed in Jacksonville, and these guys had a really interesting blend in terms of the whole nu metal sound. They're definitely nu metal, but they also blended in goth rock and post-grunge to kind of have this really interesting mix. It wasn't always heavy, but when it did get heavy, it was very nu metal heavy, especially songs like Witch or End of the World, She Said, and of course the, you know, big single that was on here, Just Got Wicked, the opening track, which pretty much if you watch that video, that's like every nu metal video ever. They're like in a sewer, there's water, there's a lot of eyeliner. Yeah, it was the nu metal thing. Scooter Ward had a very distinct voice, which was another thing that made this stand out. This sort of weird raspy delivery, and his intonation was strange. And he didn't really do a lot of like screaming or shrieking. It was mostly this kind of gravelly crooning. And lyrically, this guy honed in on depression and just pretty much stayed there, because this whole album is a giant bummer. I really enjoyed this album when it came out, and honestly, I still really enjoy some songs here. Some of them are a little too nu metal, like too, just, I don't want to remember that. But some of the songs in here are still really good, and it's a well-balanced album. It has a lot of different stuff on here. Like, if you want softer stuff, it's definitely on here. If you want some heavier stuff, it's also on here. If you just want some weird shit, it's definitely on here. And no surprise, since they're on a major label, of course, they did really well in the production. Like, very rarely do you hear any of these albums that were just really poorly produced if they were on a major label. Now, this band would definitely shoot for the radio more after they got a little bit of a taste of success on this one. I believe it was the follow-up, Year of the Spider, that had the Stupid Girl song on there, that they got Rivers from Weezer to write, essentially, for them. And, well, I mean, I don't know, the whole we're shooting for the radio thing kind of hampered them, and they kind of just started to slowly fade away. But yeah, I kind of like this one because unlike a lot of like the new metal out there wasn't like the big tough guy attitude, and that kind of got like unappealing to me. This was a little bit more sad and introspective, and yeah, you know, being, how old was I when this came out? Like 20 something. Yeah, going through breakups and stuff. This was not the thing to listen to, but I listened to it anyway. Pretty good album though. I still really enjoy this one. If you've never jammed Cold, this is probably where to start. And then the other stuff, well, check it out, form your own opinions. But yeah, this one, pretty damn good. Check it out. Project 86, Drawing Black Lines. This is their second album and major label debut. This was on Atlantic Records. Before this, they were on a label called BEC Records, which was a Christian label. This is a Christian nu metal band. And honestly, I didn't have much of a problem with that because these guys weren't super preachy, which is kind of a turnoff for me in terms of like Christian metal. These guys were kind of dark. They kind of took all that self-reflective stuff and didn't necessarily pepper God in there in terms of being out front with it. It was more like subtext. But when it came down to lyrical themes, it was mostly about drawing, you know, moral lines in the sand. And that's something I think everyone can relate to. Now, musically, this band was heavy as hell. In fact, this guitar tone on here is just absolutely massive. Now, musically, this is heavy as hell. I still really enjoy just the flat-out heft of this album. It was mixed by Garth Richardson, I think that was his name. Solid producer, does a lot of great work, and this is definitely one of them. This band started to sort of transition a bit because the first album definitely had more like rap rock sound or rap metal. Definitely still in the nu metal wheelhouse. This one showed off definitely some more songwriting maturity and definitely some different vocal approaches. You had some clean vocals, more growls, more of like a hardcore approach to them. You still had some almost rapped vocals. His vocal cadence is very strange. It was almost like kind of like a spoken word, and it definitely didn't follow like a straightforward like rhyme scheme, but he delivered them very intensely, so it didn't come off as very rappy. I gotta say though, these songs on here are really good. Me Against Me especially has a giant hook to it that I absolutely love. One Arm Man, I believe that was actually a single. Set Me Up is flat out hardcore heavy. A lot of this kind of remind me of stuff that I would hear on Victory Records, except a little bit more, you know, nu metal-y. That's probably the only big difference. The more hardcore attitude was kind of similar to like bands like Earth Crisis and stuff like that, except, you know, without all the vegan stuff. This band had an interesting career. I believe they're still around actually, but when it came down to the major labels, they only put out one other one on a major label. I believe it was called Truthless Heroes. And then they pretty much went back to Christian labels. I think they went on to Tooth and Nail, which this was distributed through Tooth and Nail and Atlantic. I don't know. But I believe they're still going on. Their sound has definitely taken some interesting turns along the way. They kind of got lumped in the emo, screamo pack for a while. I have no idea what they're doing now. I haven't picked up an album from them in quite some time, but I don't know, maybe I'll check them out again because I have pretty much nothing but good things to say about this. This is a really solid album, and again, this is one of those, if it helps, don't think of it as nu metal. It's just a heavy album, and it doesn't necessarily follow all the nu metal tropes. There are no DJs on here, I believe, thank God. And that more hardcore punch kind of helps. Either way, solid album, and I recommend checking it out. Reveille Bleed the Sky. This is the second album from this Harvard, Massachusetts rap metal band. This is probably one I can't say it's anything else because it is flat out rap metal, but honestly, it's pretty good. Now, lyrically, I really wish this didn't have so many like kind of like dumb, like, you know, stereotypical rap metal songs, but this also has some really good ones with some pretty thought out lyrics. Now, this band was really young when they got signed and put out their first album, Laced, and I think this definitely showed a little bit of maturity on the second release. I think the songs were a little bit more well constructed. Not technical. Then again, you don't think of rap rock as being technical. It's very straightforward, riff driven. I like the fact that the guitar tone in here is a very metallic tone. In fact, it has, again, kind of like a hardcore just big chug to it. It didn't go with the big like corn tone where it was extra muddy. But you do have to deal with a lot of the I'm young, I'm edgy, and yeah, kind of the stereotypical, you know, kid lyrics when it comes down to just being a pissed off teenager. You definitely got a lot on there. But again, what they kind of delivered in here were some very different songs. The title track is really well written. It's a good slow build of a song with a big massive bridge that just brings the heavy. It's a little bit more atmosphere in here, but where I think they're strongest is kind of that throwback sound to like bands like Rage Against the Machine and Downset, when they just hone in on some big chunky riffs, a really nice groove, and just deliver some solid rap metal. Now this band unfortunately had a short career, just as I think a lot of these do. They broke up in 2003, only 2 years after this release. I believe in 2002, one of their guitarists, and I believe he was one of the main songwriters, left as well, and then it just kind of fell apart from there. I believe they cited a lot of pressure from the label because this was on Elektra as well, and they wanted them to appeal to a younger crowd and write more accessible songs, but that wasn't what they wanted to do. They kind of wanted to maintain their edge. They weren't shooting for radio. In fact, the song Inside Out even calls it out. It's like, this is a radio song for all you pussies. I kind of respect that. But the label did not respect that attitude, and they were pretty much shuffled off and broke up. And I think they reunited for a couple of shows in 2008, but I think pretty much everyone has pretty much left this band, so we're left with just 2 albums. I still really enjoy this. Some of the lyrics are cringe, I will definitely say that, and it definitely feels dated, but if you're looking for some solid riffs in terms of nu metal, this is some really good, riffy, heavy stuff. While this hasn't aged as well as some of the other stuff, I still really enjoy it. And I mean, if you like rap metal and you kind of like it a little bit heavier, I would recommend checking this one out. This is a pretty solid release. Check out the first one too. I think that one's pretty good, but I think this one is definitely better. So yeah, check it out. Switched. Subject to Change. This is the debut full-length from this Cleveland-based nu metal band. Now this is another one that I can tie to Ozfest. I think I heard one of their early demos on a compilation at Ozfest from 2001, and then I saw them, I believe, in 2002 on the second stage, and this is a very straightforward nu metal, but I think what these guys did well was a lot of cool vocal hooks. In fact, the song Walk Away on here, I'm surprised that didn't become like a big single. It has an excellent vocal hook. It's got a good solid riff and melody that drives it. And again, chorus and verses, all really well done. The vocalist on here didn't necessarily growl all the time. Actually, most of this is sung, and he kind of does like a Alice in Chains sort of harmonized vocal, which of course, because I love Alice in Chains, I found very catchy. It was around this time I also got into Chimera, which Chimera is tied to this band because the frontman is also a producer, and I believe he did the production on Impossibility of Reason. So this band has like ties in terms of the Cleveland scene, but overall this was a pretty solid listen. It has a good balance of different styles in here. You get a little bit more of that, you know, corn sound that was a little bit more accessible, but you also get really heavy songs like Anymore or 10 Dead Fingers. Vocally, I like this. There are some moments in here that were maybe a little sour, but overall, you know, it had good riffs, a good groove to it, and again, another short-lived band. Now, this came out in 2002, and I think 2002 is kind of that, you know, cutoff point for a lot of nu metal. You still had some releases in 2003, but when it came down to like the labels, a lot of them were kind of shuffling off a lot of nu metal bands that had just signed, and this is one of them. Not long after this release, they pretty much split up. A lot of the band members went in different directions. Again, the frontman, Ben Schigel, I think that's his name, went on to become a producer. A lot of the other members formed different bands. In fact, I think when their bassist left, they got Corey Lowry from Stuck Mojo for a little while, but he ended up leaving as well. So this band kind of had a rough history. They did put out a follow-up, but it kind of came out a little too late, and the best thing about it was probably the fact that they included a lot of demos and such from like their earlier stuff. And it was kind of cool to hear some early versions of songs that would end up on here. But yeah, this was kind of a victim of the market changing, and they kind of got shuffled off. Good album though. I do really like this album. Again, the vocal hooks, kind of Alice in Chainsy, and the fact that this had a good variety of songs in here. makes it kind of a cool, underrated nu metal gem. They do have an EP that came out before this, but I recommend this one instead just because you get the full album experience, and yeah, the follow-up wasn't that great. But yeah, definitely check this out. Pretty good stuff. Flybanger, Headtrip to Nowhere. That name is dumb, but this band was actually pretty damn cool. This is the lone full length from this band. They were from Canada, I believe, Vancouver. But if you listen to them, you wouldn't think that. In fact, you'd probably think they were from like Texas or New Orleans, because they had a little bit of like a southern metal sound, but it was also still very nu metal. Now, I first heard about this band courtesy of the Dracula 2000 soundtrack. The song Blind World was actually on there as, I believe, more of a demo version, and I dug it. It kind of has this, you know, straightforward nu metal bounce to it, but what I really liked were these big, gravelly, but well-sung vocals, and they definitely appealed to me. So in 2001, when I saw this on a rack with the discovery price sticker, which generally meant we're trying to move as many copies as possible for cheap, I snagged it. And it even puts a warning on here. Warning, may cause excitability. Well, at the time, yeah, it did. The opening track, Calvary, I think is probably my favorite song on here. It's just this big, chuggy song with like kind of a fun old school metal gallop to it. But honestly, the bulk of this is definitely just kind of groove metal meets nu metal. It definitely has the tropes of both. It kind of has like a little bit of that Pantera swagger, but it's definitely still kind of in that, you know, Korn and Deftones sort of camp, at least at the time. You get some semi-rap vocals here and there, but most of the time it's just really well sung, like gravelly vocals, and they come off very powerful. One of my favorites on here is probably the song Evelyn. It just has this really big, awesome chorus, and I don't know, like it's just like a good sludgy rocker. Like it kind of sounds like sludge metal in a way. And then it closes in this big punk flurry, which I thought was really cool. And you do get a little bit of like a punky D-beat songs like When Are You Gonna Die, I believe, and Company. There is one giant turd on here, and that is the song Crack Balls. It's as dumb as the title. I think it's just about smoking crack. I don't know. It's just a dumb song. It's the longest song on here. But yeah, it's a blemish on what is otherwise a pretty solid album. I still enjoy this one. In fact, as soon as I cranked this one again, Calvary, I was still banging my head a lot. Some of the stuff has not aged as well, but there are some songs here that I think are just very well written and driven by some solid vocal hooks and big riffs. This might be the most Texas sounding Canadian band that I've heard in recent memory, but they were pretty damn good at it, and I enjoyed a good chunk of this album. But yeah, if you've never checked out this band before, check them out. Honestly, that first track, Calvary, should sell you, or at least get your foot in the door and make you want to listen to the rest of it. Check it out. Thumb, Exposure. This is the second album from this German nu metal / kind of hardcore band. This is kind of an interesting one because I found these guys courtesy of Victory Records samplers, because this came out on Victory Records, at least for American distribution. I believe it was the song Sell Myself, and I instantly realized that this song didn't necessarily fit in with the rest of the stuff that I was hearing on Victory Records in terms of it being more punk and hardcore oriented. This had, you know, that kind of nu metal groove. There were DJs on here, though I don't think the DJ sound necessarily fit. When it came down to production on here, this doesn't sound like a lot of nu metal albums. In fact, it sounds more like Helmet. The guitar tone is very raw. The drums sound very raw. In fact, the snare is like a very plunky snare. Yeah, if they were doing blast beats, that would sound like a slam snare. But very interesting band just in terms of their sound. It has all the qualities of hardcore, especially lyrically. It's a lot of stand up for yourself. Now, granted, it does have like the darker nu metal tropes, you know, the whole my life was fucked up. But the thing that was interesting about it is it has more of the hardcore philosophy. Is like, yeah, your life is fucked up, but stand up for it. You know, keep pushing forward. It has that sort of ethos, and I kind of like the fact that at least it didn't just complain. It said, listen, I'm going to do something about it. And I kind of appreciated that. Vocally, it does have the rapped vocals, but it's interesting because he kind of sings his way through them, and it's just a very interesting vocal approach. I like the fact that he has this kind of cool raspiness to it, and that kind of added something to it. A lot of the music on here Granted, it does have a lot of like the nu metal stuff on here. It sounds closer again to bands like Helmet or even Quicksand. It kind of has that heavy alternative sound or post-hardcore, I guess you could call it. One knock I can make on this is it is very one note. Like, honestly, there's not a lot of songs that really venture outside of this pretty standard formula. But the formula works, and the fact that this doesn't sound like a lot of nu metal releases keeps it kind of fresh. Now, this band, I believe, put out one more album and then they broke up, which, you know, is kind of a theme here in terms of short-lived bands. But I did really enjoy this one, and again, I picked this one up not necessarily looking for nu metal, and I kind of found it incidentally. I still prefer a lot of the other stuff that I got on Victory Records, just in terms of the hardcore and such, especially Strife. I still love that band, but this was a pretty solid release, and I'm glad I picked it up because it has, again, a different approach to the nu metal sound. Recommend checking it out. Form your own opinions on this one. Again, it's different sounding, but it's pretty damn interesting. So yeah, check it out. Headstrong, self-titled. This is the lone full-length from this Ontario band. Came out in 2002 on RCA Records. And this album came out long before that dickbag came out with the song about how strong his head game was. This was a really interesting band in terms of the blend of styles they brought in. Now, it definitely fits under nu metal, but also alternative and just flat-out rock. These guys knew how to write clever hooks, and for a band that rapped for pretty much a good chunk of this, they kept it clever, which I thought was unfortunately not the mainstay in nu metal. Like, generally, a lot of the lyrics really got dumbed down, but these had some really clever ones, and I was kind of surprised by that. That and the delivery. He has this odd rhythm to all the stuff on here, and I really like it because he sounds very different from a lot of other nu metal vocalists that did rap. The way he was able to switch between harsh vocals and clean vocals in terms of that rap delivery was really cool, and the fact that the band would harmonize with him and they come up with these big harmonized choruses and such, which were really catchy. They had like one big single, Adriana, and I guess it was on the charts for a little while, but unfortunately it didn't take off enough. And when it came down to songwriting, these guys were really good. Like, they threw in a lot of dynamics, a lot of good like shifts. This wasn't like sort of a one note thing. In fact, a good chunk of these songs were vastly different from one another, which with nu metal, you got a lot of the same attitude, the same kind of riffs, you know, the bouncy corn riff and shit, you know, that you always got that. These guys were good at like building tension, switching the moods. They included a lot of acoustic stuff on here, and this album just flew under the radar. In fact, so much so that the record label just bailed on them when they were mid-tour with Tommy Lee. Literally, the label just sort of dropped out on them, and, well, they became very disenchanted with the whole music industry and pretty much just quit. They all amicably broke up and said, listen, this is just gonna keep shafting us, so we're moving on. And that's super unfortunate, but this is kind of that timeline. This came out in early 2002, and this is kind of where the oversaturation of all the nu metal bands really started to kind of take over, and they started getting the chop. If they didn't meet record label expectations, then they were just pretty much yeeted into the world, and that was it. And that was pretty much the fate of a lot of bands, including this one, which sucks because this was a really good, clever album, and I think it actually added a little bit of depth to nu metal at the time. But at this point, nu metal was dying anyway, and this was, you know, like the last couple of compressions they could kind of put on there to see if they could resuscitate it, because other stuff was coming. But this is still a really good release. I thoroughly enjoy this album. Like, literally every track I still really enjoy. So some of the stuff does age pretty damn well. I strongly recommend this one. Just check it out. It has a lot of interesting appeal to, you know, alternative metal, rap metal, nu metal, all that stuff. But, you know, it's about the songwriting, the clever hooks. They are really well-written songs, and you might find yourself singing along. But yeah, definitely check this one out. It is truly an underrated gem. And finally, we have 5.0, Untitled. This is the lone full-length from this band. It came out in 2002 on Roadrunner Records. And this is only nu metal because I think people just call it a nu metal. The vocals scream kind of nu metal. They are kind of rapped occasionally. The delivery, though, is different. when you listen to the vocals, it kind of has a little bit of like a screamo-ish delivery, at least on the cleans, just the way the dude sings. And then when it came down to harsh vocals, they got harsh. In fact, there are death metal growls on here. And honestly, the music only partially sounds like nu metal. Like, there's definitely some nu metal stuff on here, but a lot of this sounded like what was coming next, which was the big wave of metalcore bands. Breakdowns, the guitar tone screamed a more metallic tone, like it was thick and chunky as hell. The overall feel on this was definitely more aggressive, but at the same time, they kind of just branched out into different directions. This was kind of like one of those jack of all trades sort of albums. They were trying different things, and they were young, they were hungry, they wanted to try some, you know, wild stuff. There's proggy elements, you have deathcore breakdowns, you have stuff that would pretty much become staples again of metalcore later. There's also really interesting synths on here. They kind of threw in a lot of synths and atmosphere, but again, it didn't scream like nu metal stuff. There was no DJs on here. It had a very different feel, and again, this album kind of felt like, you know, the shift was coming. Like, nu metal wasn't going to be around much longer, and they were right. Now, this band, of course, much like almost every band on here, was short-lived. They were only around for 4 years. They broke up not too long after this. I believe they actually split up not too long after their touring cycle for this album, which sucks because I'm kind of curious where this would have went, like in terms of what all this band could have done in terms of all the influences they brought in. I have no idea what their next direction would have been, but I imagine the nu metal stuff would have slowly faded away and they would have become something else because they had so much in their wheelhouse. They weren't just strictly bound by the nu metal sound. Hell, they didn't even look like a nu metal band. Now, this album got a fair amount of promotion, at least in terms of magazines, and it did have one track that ended up on the Resident Evil soundtrack, The Infinity, but it was probably difficult to market this band because the song sounded vastly different and there were a lot of different elements again. So finding that target demographic was probably difficult. This was probably the first time I've listened to this album in years, and honestly I appreciate it much more now than I did when I initially got it, because at that point I wanted everything to sound like Slipknot and shit. This didn't sound like that. This sounded like something older and something newer at the same time. And, well, I mean, I did jump on the metalcore bandwagon pretty quickly as soon as nu metal stopped putting out decent stuff. So yeah, this is kind of an interesting little turning point in terms of stuff that I got into. But yeah, I appreciate it much more now. I think this was really inventive at the time, and they were young kids and they were definitely hungry and wanted to make nu metal that was forward thinking, if they even consider themselves nu metal at all. But yeah, recommend checking this one out. It's a very interesting listen, and you could almost not call it nu metal, but technically I guess that's where it fits in. But then again, I don't know if this album fits in any place, but that's kind of the appeal to it, which sounds like a really good reason to check it out for me, honestly. So check it out. All right, that concludes this list. I don't know if I have enough stuff that I actually can defend in terms of nu metal to do a part 3 of this, but who knows? I can't really predict the future. I might just do it anyway. But honestly, I might try to move on to deathcore. We had a batch of deathcore releases that we reviewed, and honestly, you know, it was kind of cool going back and listening to that stuff. Granted, I'm not as into it as I was, but it was still fun to go back. And honestly, there's some really killer deathcore that I really wouldn't mind bringing up in terms of underrated albums. Going to be working on the Cannibal Corpse ranking this weekend. Looking forward to that one. It's going to be difficult as hell. I've already tweaked my list a couple of times. Again, this one's tough, but we're going to have some fun with it. And of course, plenty of bigger reviews coming up. And yeah, just a ton of stuff to keep us busy. So if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you are new to the channel, subscribe, because we do stuff like this all the time. We are also on Patreon. If you'd like to help us out there, there will be a link below in the description. We're going to start putting up stuff on there. We just got to think of what we're going to put up on there. Trying to get stuff outside of the usual outtakes and stuff, but it's coming. We also have shirts available. We were going to order some more here, but we still have plenty of extra larges, and I believe a small or two, and some double X's. So if you fit any of those sizes, please hit us up on thrallsofmetal@gmail.com. Make sure to put shirts in the message, and we will get back to you, get your size and information, hopefully get you a shirt. We also have a giveaway going on. Once we hit 7,500 subscribers, we're going to give away this big 8 CD stack that includes the new Cannibal Corpse with the uncensored artwork. All you have to do to enter is find the video that is playing on our channel for the giveaway, comment on it. There will also be a link below for it, and you are entered. That's pretty much it. Once we hit 7,500 subs, we'll do a randomizer thing, and one of you guys will win a shitload of music. I have to say, it's amazing to actually get this far. Hitting even 6,000, hell, even hitting 1,000 was amazing. So it's just cool seeing this grow as much as it has, and I'm thankful to every last one of you for, you know, joining us along the ride and keeping it entertaining as hell, because honestly, you guys are definitely a big reason why we do this, because it's fun and we love the banter, we love talking to you, and we are eternally grateful for all your help. So with that, I thank all of you, and we will catch you later.